One Sunday morning in a very small church, the sermon just seemed to go on and on and on. Unlike me, of course. The preacher just kept circling the point without quite getting there. One of the little boys in the service that day was getting more and more restless, and Mom was having a very difficult time of getting him to sit still. And finally, in the quiet of the morning, and in a whisper loud enough for the entire congregation to hear, this little tyke said, "Mama, if we just give them the money now, will they let us go home?" Do we sometimes feel that way? The story reminds me that preachers need to follow the old adage, and one that I had shared with me ever so many years ago. Stand up, speak up, shut up, and sit down. It also reminds me that everyone, even our tiniest ones, like to put in their 2 cents worth. And so this morning, as we prepare to take the next step toward stewardship faithfulness, we look to the possible origins of that phrase. In today's gospel reading, we find ourselves coming face to face with a woman who has very little material wealth. Mark simply calls her a poor widow. In reality, this woman might have been what we Southerners call dirt poor, a level of poverty where every single penny counted. So it naturally caught Jesus' attention when he saw this poor woman putting 2 small copper coins into the temple treasury. Folks, these coins were worth only about a penny. But for someone in this widow's situation, these coins might have been her $1 million. No wonder Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has given everything she has to live on." In this moment, and perhaps in today's vernacular, I can see Jesus' hands going up into the air, a radiant smile breaking out upon his face. And I hear Jesus saying, "My friends, that's what I call extravagant generosity." Thanks to our prolific economy, most of us know very little about such a sacrifice. In fact, most of us wish that we had far more material possessions and financial resources than we now have. We're like the fellow who said to his wife one morning, "Honey, I'd be happy to pay as we go if we could only finish paying for where we've been." To be sure, some of us know what it's like to have too much month left over after the end of our money. But for the most part, with a little discipline, somehow we can meet our responsibilities. And we find ourselves giving to God out of our abundance rather than out of our poverty. And today we can be thankful for that. But this we know, deep down within us, we really do know that our giving to God, not just our monetary gifts, but giving to God through our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness, reflects the very core of our values. It's a very distinct fact, an important spiritual truth, that giving doesn't necessarily reflect our income or perhaps even the state of our balance sheet, but rather giving of ourselves through all the abundance of gifts that God has given to us reflects our utmost value. And we remember on this day the words of Jesus, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart also be." You know, we human beings are quite funny when it comes to money. In a poll on money and values and commitment, Family Circle magazine some time ago did a survey. Men and women were asked what they would be willing to do for $1 million. Hear this. 11% of respondents would be willing to go on a restrictive diet for a year. I'm not so sure about that. 13% of people would give up television for a year. Surprisingly, only 34% of respondents would be willing to swallow a worm for $1 million. But a shocking 41% of people would gladly run down the block stark naked for that amount of money. These values, these numbers may or may not astonish you, but I can assure you this morning, I know of no one offering you $1 million in this sanctuary this morning to do any of these things. But this I do know, our giving to God seldom reflects our income or God's fair share. The truth of the matter is, our giving reflects our spiritual focus. Our giving reflects what's going on inside ourselves. An unknown poet addresses our willingness to share in this way. 6 humans trapped by happenstance in a dark and bitter cold. Each possessed a stick of wood, or so the story said. Their dying fire in need of logs. The first woman held hers tight, for one face around the fire was one for whom she felt spite. The next man, looking across the way, saw not one from his church and couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes. He gave his clothes a hitch. Why should his log be put to use? To warm the idle rich. The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The next man's face bespoke his greed as the fire passed from his sight, for what he saw in his stick of wood, he would need for himself that night. And the last man of this forlorn group did not accept for gain. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. The logs held tight in death's stilled hands were proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. My sisters and brothers, let us choose this day to follow in the footsteps of the one who gave the widow's mite. And in the face of doubt, and perhaps for some of us, in the face of despair, in the presence of foes and fears, let us this morning reach out, and no matter our circumstances, choose to reconnect with God as we renew our trust in the very one who gave us life, the one who has known us since before we were born. And with faith, let us hold tightly not to that which the world treasures, but let us hold tightly to that which comes from God. Let us willingly, let us choose to give up everything else. Let us choose to follow where God is leading. Let us choose this day to take the next step. The next step will be the first step of the rest of your life. Thanks be to God. Amen.